All right, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks to Liana for inviting me. So as he said, I am a research scientist at the Carnegie Institution for Science at Stanford University. So I'm not a computer scientist and I don't work in private industry, so this talk's probably a little bit different than some of the other talks that you've had. But I do think that climate scientists in general are effectively data scientists. So I think we can kind of bond over the type of data science problems that we all have. So most of us spend most of our time using high-level programming languages like R or Python or MATLAB to do all our analysis, and that's what I spend most of my time doing as well. So my hope is that at the very least you'll be able to take away from this talk how scientists in other fields use the products of computer scientists to get at questions that they're interested in. So in particular, what I'm interested in this talk is combining physical and statistical models in order to narrow uncertainty in global warming in the future. And so this is going to be focused on some research that we published at the end of last year. And so this research got a fair amount of attention. So here's just some headlines. So this is from The Guardian. This is based on our paper. Scientists have beaten down the best climate denial argument. Clouds don't act as a climate thermostat, and they're not going to save us from global warming. Here's another in Newsweek. Global warming, our most dire predictions for the future of the planet are probably right. And then this was in the Washington Post. The most accurate climate change models predict the most alarming consequences, study finds. And so some of these headlines are a little bit perhaps on the alarmist side. I wouldn't have necessarily written them that way. So the headline I wrote was actually the title of our paper, which is Greater Future Global Warming Inferred from Earth's Recent Energy Budget. And so this kind of gives away what my conclusion eventually will be here at the end of the talk. And so I'll walk you through how we kind of found this. But because this is a general audience, what I wanted to do is kind of do a digression and step way back and really frame the research in terms of the large-scale framework that we're working in. And so that's basically embodied by my main title here, which I'll just kind of walk through as an outline. So first of all, what specifically are we talking about when we're saying global warming? So global warming refers to air temperature 6 meters above the surface of the planet averaged over the entire globe. So it's that temperature averaged over the entire surface of the planet. And when we're talking about contemporary global warming, we're usually talking about the fact that the Earth's average temperature, defined in that way, has warmed by about 1 degree Celsius since the 1800s. So observations here measured from surface air meteorological stations as well as ships and buoys and satellites and a bunch of other things show that we've warmed about 1 degree Celsius since the 1800s in yellow here. And so we're interested in projections of global warming. So how warm is it going to get in the future? So we're very confident that most of this warming, most of this 1 degree Celsius warming that we've seen since the 1800s is due to increases in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. So specifically carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And so as we go into the future and we burn more fossil fuels because it underlies our entire energy system, we expect the Earth's temperature to continue to warm, but as you can see, there's this large fanning spread of uncertainty. And so the idea is to narrow uncertainty in that. And so in order to kind of explain how we go about doing that, I will take a fairly, a large fraction of my talk to kind of do a digression into basic climate science to kind of show where that uncertainty comes from and then show how we try to narrow that uncertainty. So I'll talk about the physical climate models. So these are the mathematical physical climate models that are used to both hindcast how we think temperature should have evolved in the past and then project temperature into the future. I'll talk about how those work. And then specifically, I'll eventually get to what we did, which was combining these physical global climate models with observations in a statistical framework to try to hopefully narrow uncertainty in projections of global warming. So first of all, it is kind of important to note that the uncertainty in global warming going into the future is of pretty large political relevance because you have things like the Paris Accord. And if you'll notice, the Paris Accord has language in it. So this is the international agreement that all the countries of the world basically signed, and then the United States dropped out in a kind of high-profile move. But the language of the Paris Accord uses this global average surface temperature as its main metric in terms of progress. So it says the agreement aims to respond to the global climate change threat by keeping global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So in this graph, I've started it at 0. This doesn't mean 0 Celsius, so everything is relative to a pre-industrial baseline here. So actually, the Earth is like 288 Kelvin, and these physical climate models do simulate that because they're physical models. But I've just started at 0, so that means 2 is the limit that's being talked about here, so 2 degrees above pre-industrial. And so you can see that this uncertainty really is important for that because it depends, how much warming we get for a given amount of increases in greenhouse gases, how uncertain that is will affect policy prescriptions in terms of how much we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to meet a temperature target like this. One important point about the uncertainty is that most of this uncertainty, most of this fanning spread in future global warming doesn't actually have anything to do with the physical climate system. So we call this scenario uncertainty. This is the uncertainty with these different colors. So what these different colors are different scenarios going into the future that have different levels of population, different levels of GDP, different demographics, different technology change assumptions. So all those things are like socioeconomic variables that are really difficult to try to reduce uncertainty in. So demographers and geographers do run models of population and demographics and induced technology change and various things like that. But for our study, we're basically saying we're not even going to deal with that uncertainty. The uncertainty that we're dealing with is called response uncertainty. And so what response uncertainty essentially is, this is our central question, is how much global warming should we expect for a given increase in the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. So that would be like if you zoom in on any one of these scenarios. Any one of these scenarios fixes the trajectory of greenhouse gases going into the future. And so then the spread about any one of those colors represents the physical uncertainty in terms of the physical system, in terms of how much warming you get if you assume some level of increased greenhouse gas trajectory going into the future. So you can see that this uncertainty is still pretty large. So the models that project the least amount of global warming for a given increase in the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases project about half as much as the warming projected by the models that project the most global warming. So this is actually like a huge difference in terms of impacts. So from 3.2 Celsius to 6 Celsius, that's something like 6 Fahrenheit to 11 Fahrenheit. That difference between 6 and 11 Fahrenheit probably makes a huge difference in terms of impacts on ecosystems or eventual sea level rise or various other impacts. And so it would be definitely valuable if we could reduce this response uncertainty. And so that's why we set out to have that as our goal. So this is our central question. And I think it's valuable to understand why it's difficult to answer this question by taking a step back and kind of thinking about the climate system just from first principles. In this case, the first law of thermodynamics. So this is basically the first law of thermodynamics. We're just saying that the change in temperature of anything, in this case the change in temperature of the surface of the planet, is going to be related to the heat capacity of that thing, and then the net flux of energy incident on that thing, right? So if the net flux is 0, then you have no change in temperature. If the net flux is positive, then you have a positive change in temperature with time. And if it's negative, you have a negative change in temperature with time. And so we can think about this equation as basically applying to this kind of one-dimensional conceptual model of the climate system, where we have space, what we refer to as the top of the atmosphere, the ocean. And so if we think about where a net flux of energy could come from, basically, we think about where energy comes from in the climate system, like there's some geothermal energy and there's some energy coming from stars that are not the sun. But for the most part, it's all going to be driven by a net flux at the top of the atmosphere, and so this all starts with the sun. So the sun is giving us essentially all of the energy that's incident on the planet. So that amounts to about 340 watts per meter squared. So that's a flow of energy, so watts, a joule per second. And so part of that energy is reflected back to space by things like clouds. So 76% or 76 watts per meter squared are reflected back to space by clouds. Some of that is reflected back to space by the surface of the planet. So we can think of this intuitively, like if you ever just see a picture of the Earth, anything that's light is by definition light being reflected back towards your eyes, right? So a desert that's basically looks white from space, or clouds or ice, these things that look white from space are highly reflective, and so they're reflecting that light back to space. And then so 100 watts per meter squared are being reflected back to space. So that means we have 240 left being absorbed by the surface of the planet. And so Planck's law tells us that anything with a temperature radiates, but the Earth is much colder than the sun, so the Earth is going to radiate at a wavelength that's longer than the light that's coming in from the sun. So the Earth is emitting infrared radiation or heat radiation or long wave radiation, and so that is trying to escape to space, but it's being inhibited by things in the atmosphere like water vapor and clouds. So 75% of the current greenhouse effect comes from water vapor and clouds, and so all the greenhouse effect is just, it just means that there's certain things in the atmosphere that interact with this longer wavelength radiation more than they interact with shortwave radiation. And so these things are interacting with this long wave radiation, but eventually it does escape to space. And so in this case, I've drawn it so 240 watts per meter squared is escaping to space. So that means we have 240 coming in, right? 340 minus 100, and then 240 leaving. So in this case, the net flux is 0. So this would be like an equilibrium situation where there's no change in temperature. So what ends up happening is humans are burning fossil fuels, and so that increases the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, which interacts more with this long wave radiation than the short wave radiation. And so that induces an initial perturbation in the system, such that you're reducing how much energy is leaving. And so that results in a net flux, a positive flux, because it's less energy escaping to space. And so what that means is that you're going to start inducing a temperature change. And so to really show where the uncertainty comes in, it's helpful to kind of to break up this net flux term into two terms. So we can look at it in terms of a forcing. That's basically like increasing greenhouse gases or increasing the amount of energy coming in from the sun. That's a forcing on the system. And then the other term is the feedback. So this is usually defined by this climate feedback parameter. And you can see the feedback parameter is multiplied by a change in temperature. So that means that once you force the system and you start changing the fluxes, then the temperatures are going to change, and that's going to start moving other fluxes around. So to make this explicit, we can set this at steady state and solve for the change in temperature. And so what this is saying is that a change in temperature is related to the forcing divided by that feedback. And so the feedback is essentially once you force the system and start changing the temperature, these other fluxes are going to change, right? So clouds depend on temperature because clouds form when relative humidity is 100%. Relative humidity depends on temperature. Ice obviously depends on temperature because water has a freezing point. Water vapor in the atmosphere depends on temperature due to a relationship called the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. So when it's warmer, the atmosphere can have more water vapor in it. And so, people who have lived on the East Coast and Midwest know that. So all of these other fluxes, once you start changing temperature, they can all shift as well. And so now we can kind of start to see where this uncertainty in future warming, we're trying to get at this question of where this uncertainty comes from. Why is this a hard question to answer? And so one way to make this explicit is just to expand this equation a little bit more and to say, okay, the change in temperature is related to the change in greenhouse gases in the future times the change in forcing per a change in greenhouse gases times a term related to the feedback. So if we go through these and see where the uncertainty comes from, okay, it's not going to come from the change in greenhouse gases because of how we've defined our question, right? We've defined our question that it's for a given increase in atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. So we're assuming this uncertainty away. There's no uncertainty in that. There's very little uncertainty in this physically. So this is the amount of forcing, the amount of watts per meter squared forcing that you get if you, say, increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is if you double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from 280 parts per million, that's what it was before pre-industrial, or that's what it was pre-industrial, to 560 parts per million. That's about a 3.7 watts per meter squared forcing on the system, on the climate system, and that is known within a very small range. So that's uncontroversial. There's not a lot of uncertainty with that. So small uncertainty on that term. But this is where the uncertainty comes in. So the feedback parameter has to do with once you increase greenhouse gases, how do all these other fluxes change? How do clouds change? How does ice change? How does water vapor change? And then how does that end up changing this whole flux at the top of the atmosphere? That's what is much harder to understand. And so there's a large uncertainty in that, and then that bleeds into why you get this large uncertainty in change in temperature going into the future, and why we have some models that show twice as much warming as other models. It's because they change clouds and ice and water vapor, et cetera, differently than the other models. Yeah. The question is it that we can't measure it or that we don't understand it physically? And I would just say let's hold off, because I think the rest of the talk is kind of about that. Yeah. So just kind of a preview, you can also break this uncertainty down into two terms. So you can break it down into the outgoing shortwave radiation component, so that's this part, or the outgoing long-wave radiation component. And so I'll come back to that. So there's various ways of trying to get at trying to narrow this range of uncertainty. And so the way that I will focus on for the rest of this talk is basically you take a physical global climate model, a mathematical climate model, and you increase greenhouse gas concentrations in that model, and you have it essentially calculate all of these flux changes. And so it's going to change temperature by explicitly simulating these adjustments in all the fluxes. And so this is what I was referring to before. These are these projections that I was showing before. So just some background on these physical global climate models. So they're mathematical, mechanistic models, mechanistic in the sense that you have kind of fundamental physical equations, like you have equations like F equals ma. So not necessarily just like a linear regression where there's a tuned parameter, but something that's grounded in fundamental physics for the most part. And so they're run on supercomputers in general. So this is the Blue Fire supercomputer at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So that is 77 teraflops, and so that was installed in 2008, and so I think at the time it was like a top 25 fastest computer, but of course now it's like orders of magnitude behind the fastest computers. But we still, I think the Summit computer at Oak Ridge National Lab is just being installed, and there's going to be climate models run on that. So climate models and particle physics models tend to be two of the types of models that get a lot of time on these supercomputers. So the models themselves are not that long in terms of code, so about 1 million lines of code, so less than a lot of operating systems. So it's not, that they're particularly long code-wise, but they do require an exceptional amount of calculations and an exceptional amount of memory. So they're developed at many centers around the world. So this is just kind of highlighting some of the most prominent centers that develop these global climate models. So the one I just mentioned is at NCAR in Boulder, National Center for Atmospheric Research. The other main ones in the United States are the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab at Princeton and the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in Manhattan. And then now the Department of Energy is just starting to develop its own climate model. So at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, they're going to have a climate model as well. So all these centers are kind of competing with each other, right? Like everyone wants the best model, and they all have different ways of going about how to best simulate various aspects of the climate system. So the basic idea of these models is that you discretize the whole Earth system in space and time. So you're really building a virtual world. This is very different than a statistical model. It's actually trying to represent everything that exists in space and time through physical equations. So the whole world is discretized in terms of space and time, and then within each box, many processes are attempting to be simulated. So you have heat exchange from the ocean to the atmosphere and from the atmosphere to the land and vice versa, and various dynamic changes in the land surface, and the more advanced models are doing photosynthesis and full chemistry, and so then they're developing clouds and dissipating clouds, and you have radiation, and you have just lots of things going on. And so you can see where this immense amount of computation starts to become necessary. And yeah, so the basic idea is that you're using the laws of physics, and you're kind of just stepping forward in time. So you're using fundamentally, you're using, like conservation of momentum to calculate time derivatives in the wind, conservation of energy to calculate time derivatives in temperature, conservation of mass to calculate time derivatives in density. You're, keeping track of water in the system, and you have other constraints. So, you notice that these are all time derivatives. So what that means is that the model fundamentally has to step forward in time. So it's very analogous just going outside and looking at the weather. The model is going to use the previous time step to calculate the next time step and the next time step and the next time step. And it's going to simulate as many things as possible. And there's going to be weather in the model just like there is in the real world. And so the time step of these models currently tends to be about 30 minutes. So over time, as you might have imagined, as computer power has increased, the number of processes explicitly included in the model has increased. Yeah?
You said the time step is 30 minutes. How many time steps are you doing overall in simulation?
So the simulations that I'm referring to here generally are like a couple hundred years. So it's like they start, the ones that are most relevant for global warming projections and for attribution of past warming start in 1850 and then go to 2100. And so depending on the machine, sometimes these runs take a month of wall time or clock time. Yeah.
Is the same models that are used to forecast the weather you see on TV?
They are not the same models, but they are essentially, it's the same idea. Yeah. And I mean, there's other conceptual differences where those are generally atmospheric models that as a boundary condition have like sea surface temperature prescribed, and they're not going to change greenhouse gases or whatever. And so when you run those models forward in time, it's just the atmospheric dynamics that they're trying to calculate. Where with these models, they have that same atmospheric dynamics, but then that's coupled to an ocean model, and that's coupled to a sea ice model, and coupled to, in the most advanced ones, you have land surface dynamics and you have ice sheet dynamics. And so all those things are moving together because we think those processes are important on longer timescales where they're not important for a 3-day or 5-day weather forecast. But I should probably just mention the conceptual difference between a weather forecast and a climate forecast. That, past about 5 days, the chaos in the atmosphere takes over such that it's basically unpredictable. And so you would never, so if you run a climate model, say for 100 years, it will have weather in New York in 2077. Like it will, July 17th, 2077, there will be a weather forecast for that day in the global climate model. But no one would take that seriously, right? Because everyone knows that past about 5 days, the specific day-to-day weather is unforecastable. But what you could take seriously is if you average over the 2070s and you look at average precipitation in that model and you compare that to, say, the 1970s, and you say, oh, there's an increase in average precipitation in New York over those 2 blocks of time, that would be something that potentially could be taken seriously, even though the day-to-day weather would not line up. And so there's chaos in the atmosphere that's unpredictable, but on longer time scales, if greenhouse gas increases can change something about, say, precipitation, then you would see that when you average over longer time periods. Yeah.
You said you marched forward in time from maybe day 0 today, but is there a concept of back testing your models because you have data from really accurate data, say from the 70s at least, so you can march forward and see how accurate your model has been?
Yeah, so the question is about back testing the models to see how accurate they've been in the past. And that is essentially where I'm going, that's what we end up doing. Yeah. So just to continue briefly with kind of the history of these. So we started kind of,
So where did the 30 minutes come from? Is that a machine thing or is that a physical thing?
I think, yeah, it's a compromise. I mean, we would like to have higher resolution in time and space, the higher kind of the better. But it has to do with the discretization in space and matching that with the discretization in time.
What is a cell in space?
I'll show it in like one slide. Yeah, a couple hundred kilometers. So this is just increasing processes over time. So in the 70s, we started putting CO2 in climate models to see what they did, but back then there wasn't clouds or surface processes or ocean or all these other things. So that might be a surprise to some people because I think a lot of people only kind of heard about global warming like in the 2000s. But we've actually known since 1864 that CO2 was likely to increase temperatures on the surface of the planet. And so ever since climate modeling's been around, that's been something people have been interested in. And you don't need to worry about these acronyms, but this is basically 1990, 1995, 2001, and 2007. And this basically still kind of looks like the state of modeling today. There's more processes. And then the spatial resolution has changed over time. So in 1990, this is what Europe looked like in a global climate model. So just basically a couple pixels for the whole continent. And it's not all that great even today. So this is essentially representing 10 years ago, but most of the models actually still do look like this, that they're about 100 kilometers in resolution. So if you look at, say, like Ireland, there's only a handful of pixels for Ireland. And so anytime you're hearing something specific about a certain location and about projections of climate change, you should definitely take that with a grain of salt, because most of those projections are originating from some model that is basically this type of resolution. And then there's various ways to downscale that. People put the boundary conditions from a model like this into a higher resolution model. So you can do dynamical downscaling or statistical downscaling. But usually the large scale boundary projection is coming from something that looks like this. So this is we're kind of stuck at this resolution for now in terms of running these models for like a couple hundred years. But I will show you what they look like when they're run for a shorter period of time, but at a very high resolution, both spatial resolution and time resolution. So this is, you can kind of see the time resolution here. These are days going forward. So this is September 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 2005. And this is an atmospheric model. So this particular model does not have a dynamic ocean. So a boundary condition is the ocean here. It's just forcing the model with heat fluxes and sea surface temperatures. And then the atmosphere is free running. So the atmosphere is calculating everything just based on those kind of fundamental physical equations. And so you can see this kind of shows us why these types of climate models are useful, is because everything that's important in the climate system is an emergent property of those underlying physical equations. So you have these situations where the model is saying, oh, you get these large mid-latitude cyclones. So these are the types of things that you see on weather maps with cold fronts and warm fronts attached to them. You'll see, if you look at like the Atlantic Ocean, hurricanes will spin up and start moving towards land. You can see the day passing in time, and every time the day moves over, say, South America, you can see thunderstorms pop up. And all this stuff is happening like just as an emergent property of the underlying physics, right? So there's no code that says make hurricanes form and then move this way. There's no code that says make the flow of the jet stream go this way in this hemisphere and this way in this hemisphere. Like that's just coming from the Coriolis effect that's built into the rotation of the planet. And so this is what makes these models useful. Because if you increase, say, greenhouse gases in a model like this, and it does something to clouds, it changes clouds in some way, or it changes hurricanes in some way, that is a prediction of the model. It's not programmed into the model explicitly, right? It's the physical equations are programmed into the model, but the result, what actually changed, is something that the model is predicting. It's not begging the question in the formal logical sense.
So it's really a simulation-based output, right? So that means there is probably like a range of observed evolved curves, right? I mean, you're showing the mean curve or mean evolution, or there must be a range, right?
Yeah. So if you were to, I didn't do this doodle, by the way. I don't know if this is someone is drawing on my screen. But, or maybe I did it. Anyway, so if you were to run the model again with the same, so the question is there like a range of model output, right? That if you were to run it again, would you get different results? Yeah, and yes. So this model, this is just one hypothetical state that the atmosphere could have evolved in out of basically infinite states. So you're forcing it with sea surface temperatures that match observations on these days, and it's doing things that look similar to what the real climate system would do, but because of that chaos in the atmosphere, we don't expect it to match up, that these clouds would be exactly the way that they were at this time, et cetera. So if you were to go back and run it again and perturb temperature by 10 to the negative 14th in one grid cell, by a week later, the atmosphere is totally different in the model. So that butterfly effect, that chaos is represented just by the equations, just by the physical equations in the model. And so, yeah, you could run it 1,000 times, and then you would have a boundary of where you think, precipitation should be. And then if observations are within that boundary, then you basically say, well, the model is doing about as well as we could expect it to do.
That's how you validate the goodness of this model.
Yep.
So that says that the model is dominating the measurements. Is that fair, or am I getting that right?
The model, you ask if the model is dominating the measurements.
Okay, so there are two kinds of inputs here. One is the physics,
Yeah.
and the other is all the measurements.
Yeah, so the measurements only come in terms of sea surface temperature. So there's no, the atmosphere is totally unconstrained by measurements. There's no measurements telling the atmosphere.
How many, so I,
Those are boundary conditions.
You start at the seed and then it continues with there.
Yeah, so the atmosphere, so the way that you're getting clouds here is just that the atmosphere is saying, okay, when relative humidity is 100%, form a cloud. And when saturation pressure goes lower, rain that out. And so there's no observation of the atmosphere updating until,
observation of the sea temperature.
yeah.
You have, I don't know, like thousands of those or something, or?
Yeah, by this time frame, we basically, this is the satellite era, so you know what the sea surface temperature is everywhere. Yeah.
I note the Sahara Desert gets very few clouds in this model.
Yep.
And Canada gets one, everything.
Yeah, and we have snow. You can see the snow on the ground. So that's an atmospheric model.
So again, but the satellite temperatures are all changing as a function of time. I'm trying to get at the inputs here.
Yeah. So the inputs are just, since it's just a free-running atmospheric model, which can deposit snow on the ground. But other than that, the boundary is updating sea surface temperatures hourly, like at this time frame, from the ocean. And then I guess probably in this model, the land is like, it's some very simple representation where there's no like forcing from the land, but it's like not a dynamic thing. It's just kind of like a sponge. Yeah, yeah. And just to show you what an ocean model looks like, this is the same idea, except in this particular model, I believe this boundary forcing is now the atmosphere is forcing the ocean. And so you're looking at salinity. So here's Greenland. So this is showing you again, like it's patterns in the ocean. You see these eddies and these flows going everywhere. It's something that you would never expect the model to get exactly right, that there is an eddy at this time that looked just like that. But it's something that you would expect to get the general broad patterns correct, and maybe the frequency of various things correct, and the fact that you see certain currents that are very quick along boundaries, you would want that to be accurate in terms of its comparison with observations. Yeah, I mean, it's just the fundamental physical limits of predictability here, that you can't expect it to get the details correct. But that's what the challenge of climate forecasting is that if you increase a forcing on the system, like you increase greenhouse gases, in the long run, the temperature, the global average temperature, or the temperature locally goes up. But it's still, that doesn't mean that we can predict the weather 5 days from now. So it's similar to like the seasonal cycle, right? That right now it's June, and in December we know it's going to be colder because the system is being forced externally. There's going to be less sunlight, the days are going to be shorter, and so it's going to be colder in December than it is now. And we know that from the external forcing on the system. But we still have no idea what December 12th is going to be relative to December 11th. You don't know those details. And so that's kind of the conceptual idea behind climate.
So then why don't you just enlarge the granularity until the granularity matches the physics? I'm still missing something here.
Maybe some questions would be good for after the talk.
Sorry.
Okay. Anyway, this is my last example of a model. So this is kind of comparing the two resolutions that we're talking about, where we're kind of stuck. This is an atmospheric representation of clouds and storms, that right now we're still kind of stuck at this resolution. We can run these for short periods of time, but not over the 100, 200 years you could hypothetically do it, but the way that these models tend to be archived, they're generally at this resolution for the type of global warming experiments that we're looking at in our study. And so that presents a problem, because basically for a lot of models, basically the spatial scale, the resolution, is not sufficient to represent a lot of important processes in the climate system. And so what that means is that these processes have to be what's called parameterized. And what parameterized basically means is that you're using some formula or some algorithm or something that's only kind of semi-physical and has these tunable parameters in it that are poorly constrained. So an example of this would be like cloud fraction. So if you want to calculate, so I was just showing like clouds are really important for the climate system, and they're very important for these fluxes that matter in terms of how much warming we expect for a given increase in the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. But if you look at, okay, over Ireland or over Britain, if you want to calculate what the cloud fraction is, as in the fraction of that grid box that's covered by clouds, you can't just say to the model, oh, when it's 100% relative humidity, form a cloud there. Because the spatial resolution is too large, it's never going to be 100% relative humidity over that whole grid box. So what you have to do is you have to use a parameterization. So this is the cloud fraction subroutine in the Community Earth System model, so just one of these global climate models. And so this is, you'll notice it's written in Fortran, so most climate models are written in Fortran still. I guess it's just a legacy thing that people kind of swap modules, and they were originally written in Fortran and they're still written in Fortran. But yeah, so this says, calculate cloud fraction using the relative humidity threshold. Threshold depends on pressure upon the presence or absence of convection as defined by a reasonably large vertical mass flux. And then it says, okay, set Wang and Sasson parameters, set Schilling parameters. So these parameters, this ABC, these are the parameterizations. These are these numbers that are important for how the model calculates clouds in a given grid box, and then they're important for how much warming the model calculates in terms of future warming for a given amount of increase in greenhouse gases. But they're not really physical, and you can't really go out and measure them. And so that's essentially where this uncertainty comes in from a modeling perspective. So going back to our equation, we said there's not uncertainty in this thing because we defined it away. We're saying for a given increase in the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. There's not a large uncertainty in the flux change for a given change in greenhouse gases. The uncertainty comes from these changes in the other fluxes. And we can see now in these models, the uncertainty explicitly comes from the parameterizations not being basically like measurable. You can't go out and measure that A equals 26 whatever and get that and nail that thing down. So most of the uncertainty comes from these changes in fluxes that you get, so like changes in clouds. And so what our study did, the fundamental kind of idea behind our study, is that these mechanistic physical models, these computer climate models that are most accurate, that have the most accurate parameterizations, they should be the most skillful at simulating the future amount of warming. And they should also be the most skillful in other contexts, like simulating the recent past, right? Because it should be one physics. There shouldn't be some physics now and then the physics changes in the future. It's the same physics. And so if they're good at one thing, they should be good at the other thing if the physics is constant. So the way that we kind of go about answering this question is through what's called the emergent constraints paradigm. And the idea behind this is that you have something that you can observe currently, which we end up calling the predictor variable here. And you have all of these global climate models, and you have some spread in how they predict this thing currently. So an example would be how much shortwave radiation is reflected from clouds. That could be your predictor. And this spread represents spread in terms of how these different models decide to parameterize, say, cloud fraction in the model. So they all make different choices about how to do that, and so then they get different answers in terms of how much reflected shortwave radiation they would get from clouds. And then the idea is you want to relate this something that you can observe currently to something that you can observe but you would like to know, so like a change in temperature going into the future. So if the relationship looked like this wouldn't tell you much, right? Because it would mean that there's a large spread in how models simulate this current thing that you can observe, but they all tell you that it's going to warm the same amount in the future. So that means that basically what you want to know in the future is well constrained without you having to know anything about this predictor variable. But in general, what you find is relationships kind of like this, where there's not really a relationship. And so this isn't very helpful either. So you have a situation where the models do something all over the place for the thing you can observe, and they also do something all over the place for the thing you want to know in the future. And so then you can come along with an observation and say, oh, observations are here, but that doesn't tell you anything in terms of what the thing is that you want to know in the future. And so what you're looking for is something with a kind of simple linear relationship. So I'm going to show everything in terms of just 2 dimensions and as if it was simple linear regression, but the statistics that we do are actually more sophisticated than that. It's not just simple linear regression, but it's kind of the only way to be able to visualize it. But the idea is that you have some strong statistical relationship, right? And so then you can come along and say, okay, observations are here, and this predictor, hopefully, is something that physically makes sense that it should be related to this predictand, so change in temperature in the future. And so then that tells us something about how much warming we should get in the future if observations are here. And if observations were here, then it would mean that we would expect, less warming in the future. And so this is what our study is essentially doing, is we're making observationally informed estimates of future warming based on statistical relationships across global climate models, where we're saying, okay, different models predict different things in terms of something that we can currently observe, and observations tell us that some models are a lot closer to being right than others, and then that tells us something about how much warming we should expect in the future. And so the way that we quantify that is we then compare it to the central estimate of warming from the model. So if you just average them all together and you got a central estimate, that would be your central guess, and then we end up comparing the observational estimate to that. So the concept here is kind of like ending model democracy, where like before you have one model, one vote. You say every model gets one vote, and then the mean is our best estimate, where this is saying, no, we can do better than that. We can actually use observations to identify the models that are doing the best in terms of these parameterizations, and so then they should be kind of weighed more in terms of what they're projecting for the future. So then the question becomes, what variables are appropriate to use as this predictor? So I was already kind of hinting at this one, this reflected shortwave radiation. It should be potentially a good variable to use because it's related to those parameterizations that then feed into the uncertainty in future warming, because it's the feedbacks and the fluxes that cause the uncertainty in future warming. So going back to our energy budget diagram, what we end up using for our predictor variables are outgoing shortwave radiation, outgoing long-wave radiation, and then the net flux, which is just incoming shortwave radiation minus these 2 terms. And then we kind of use these, so these are our 3 variables, and then we use 3 different attributes of these variables. So we use mean climatology, which is just the average over a period of time. We use the magnitude of the seasonal cycle over the observational record. And we also use the magnitude of monthly variability. So every month you have some deviation from from the average seasonal cycle. And so we use that. And so we have these 9 predictor fields that we use. And so I'll just show you what these look like, what the patterns look like. So this is if you averaged all the models together, and the time frame here is 2001 to 2015, because that's when we have observations available. So this is like the average outgoing shortwave radiation. If you were to look down at the Earth, how many watts per meter squared are coming back up at your eyes? This is the average outgoing shortwave radiation over that time period, over all the models. So this is like 30 to 40 global climate models. And I'll just toggle, so first I'll show you that we then compare that to observations that come from the CERES satellite record. So CERES is the Cloud and Earth's Radiant Energy System, which is an instrument on a couple satellites run by NASA. And so that's available from 2001 to 2015. And so we can compare then what the models do to what the CERES satellite observations does. So I'm just toggling back and forth between those two things. And you can see that the models and observations generally agree in terms of like the overall patterns that you see. So like if you just kind of look at this pattern, this is model mean, this is observations, this is model mean, observations. And so, you know, depending on your disposition, you may think that's good or bad. To me, like, I'm kind of an optimist, so I think this is pretty good, that they match as well as they do. And again, the reason that you would think that it would be good is because the models are not explicitly coded to do what they do. Like, this pattern is an emergent property of the underlying physics of the model. And so the fact that it basically matches observations is impressive. Like, it tells us that we essentially understand why this pattern looks the way that it does, that it essentially comes about just from the underlying physics. So we have this, the idea is that our predictors here have a straightforward connection to the physical processes that will influence the projected global warming, which is this feedback uncertainty. And it samples these things in a flexible way. So the idea is to kind of think of it like an obstacle course, where you are you're seeing how well the models do at these things that are not necessarily related to long-term warming. And so you're trying to get at just, do they get the physics right? And seeing, like, you know, if one model does well in all 3 of these tasks and with all 3 of these variables, then that means that it's probably getting the physics the closest to being correct. But we do have to guard against overfitting. So this is where we're wrapping the statistical model on top of all of these physical climate models. And so this is probably something that's much more familiar to people in the room, because I know that you know, anyone that does anything with neural networks and things like that has to be very cognizant of this. And so what we use to avoid overfitting is cross-validation. So the idea is, again, I'm just representing this in 2 dimensions, but we're actually using partial least squares regression that compresses those patterns into 1 dimension, but it's just easiest to visualize it this way. But with cross-validation, we're basically saying, okay, let's leave one out, cross-validation. We have all these training models, we have a predictor and a predictand. We are going to take a test model, we're going to pull it out, make sure that the statistical procedure is blind to that test model, so it refits to just the training models. Then we pretend that this test model is essentially observations, right? And so then we can use the statistical relationship from the other models, the training models, to make a forecast for what we think this test model should be in terms of its future warming, in terms of its predictand. And if that was just observations, then we'd be stuck. We'd just have to wait until the future to see if that prediction came true. But in this case, the test model actually does have a future warming value. So now we know how well the other models constrained that test model. So we have an error there. And so then we can do that with every single model. You pull it out, you have the statistical relationship train on the other models, you make a forecast pretending that this test model is observations, and then you see how well your statistical relationship did. And so you then end up with a distribution of errors, and that helps inform then how well you think the statistical procedure is doing in terms of quantifying how well it will actually then constrain future warming in the real world. And so we quantify that with a spread ratio, which is just the ratio between the root mean square errors of these cross-validated errors versus if you would just pick the model mean every single time. So kind of the null, naive thing to do would just be to guess the model mean for every single model, and we're comparing that to using the cross-validated errors. And so that's one component of our results, is how that spread ratio changes. And then the other component of the results is the prediction ratio, which would be the ratio between how much warming we're actually expecting in the future versus, again, if you had just predicted the model mean. So how much warming based on the observations versus the model mean. So I'll just show you some results. So this basically, you don't need to worry about the details of this. Essentially what this says is that this is a bunch of sensitivity tests, that when we alter the different predictors and the predictands, we tend to get the same result. And that result is that we get greater central estimates of future warming with reduced uncertainty ranges. And so the central estimates increase by about 15%, so about 15% more warming than we would expect if we were just guessing the model mean. And then the reduced uncertainty ranges are on the order of like 30%. So we're reducing that spread by about 30%. If we assume that observations are essentially like one of the models in the ensemble. And so this plot just basically shows that this central result is insensitive to a bunch of things. So the number of, I didn't go into the partial least squares regression part of this, but it's insensitive to the number of partial least squares regression components used, and it's insensitive to how we vary this predictor-predictand combinations. So we're switching out a bunch of different things to test if it works, if it's robust. So this is what the results essentially look like for one of these projections going into the future. So this is that steepest future emission scenario projection. This is RCP 8.5. So this would be like if humans increase greenhouse gases by a lot going into the remainder of the century. And so this is the raw model spread. And here's the historical range, here's observations, and then here's the central estimate and the spread about that central estimate. And so this is what the projection looks like when it's constrained with observations, where basically you're saying, okay, the models that are doing the best in simulating the radiation budget of the recent past, if we're essentially weighing towards those models, this is what the projection of the future looks like. And so one thing that's kind of interesting to bring up is that you'll see, on TV or even in front of Congress, you'll see it argued a lot that the projections of future global warming should be taken less seriously on the grounds that climate models do a poor job of simulating the climate of the past, of the recent past. And so what our study shows is that it's absolutely the case that a lot of models do a bad job of simulating the recent past. But what we find is that models that do the best tend to warm the most in the future. So it doesn't really make sense to say that we should dismiss the most severe projections of global warming because models are doing a poor job. If anything, it's basically what our results show is that we should dismiss the least severe projections of global warming because those models that produce the least amount of global warming are the ones that do the worst in terms of predicting the recent past. So I'll just quickly show you that we can gain some kind of physical insight as to what's going on, why some of these climate models might be doing better in simulating the future. So I'll just focus on one of these predictor fields. So this is the outgoing shortwave radiation mean climatology, so the average flux, if you're looking down at the Earth, that's being bounced back to space, the average solar energy being bounced back to space. And what I'm showing here are partially squared regression loading coefficients, which I won't go into what that is, but what that means is that positive values mean that the physical climate models that have more outgoing shortwave radiation at that location tend to warm more in the future. And negative values mean that models with more outgoing shortwave radiation at that location tend to warm less in the future, or vice versa. Models with less outgoing shortwave radiation there warm more in the future. And so this pattern then, you can then compare to observations. And so that's what we're doing with the contours. And so solid contours are positive, and the dotted contours are negative. And so to the degree that those two things correlate, the observations and these loading coefficients, that means that observations are telling us that that basically the model ensemble is biased low, or that we should expect more warming than the model mean. So basically what's going on is that observations are positive where these values are positive. So it's saying, okay, the predictor is telling us that we should expect more warming from this location. And observations tend to be negative or below the model mean anyway in these locations where the relationship is negative. So in both cases, they're showing the change in temperature going into the future should be larger than what the average model would say. And so this makes sense actually physically, because if you just look at, say, this location, so what this is saying is that models that reflect more of the sun's energy back to space warm more in the future. And like the easiest way to think about this would just be with sea ice. So like models that have more sea ice now can warm more in the future because they have more sea ice to melt. So if you start off with no sea ice, then you're never going to get that positive feedback where you start melting sea ice and that warms more and that absorbs more solar radiation and that causes more sea ice to melt and that enhances your warming. But if you start off with a lot of sea ice, then you have a lot of potential for a positive feedback to really enhance that warming. And so that's what you're seeing. And you're also seeing the same thing with clouds. If you start off with a lot of clouds, right, the ocean is almost black if you're looking down from space, and clouds are almost perfectly white. So if you start off with a lot of clouds, then you have a lot of potential to reduce clouds, which is going to then induce a net flux more efficiently, or it's going to have a higher potential for a larger change in flux. And so then that feeds back on the temperature change. And so observations are telling us that the models that warm the least essentially don't have enough of these clouds and sea ice in the base state, and so that's why they're not warming enough, because they're inaccurate in how they're simulating the base state. So just to summarize, the big idea here is that we're just taking these physical, mathematical, global climate models that have all of these just emergent properties that they're simulating. And then we're combining them in a statistical framework with observations from satellites and using those observations and the relationship across models to hopefully constrain something that we care about in the future but can't observe, and that's the amount of future warming. And so that's kind of our central result. So that's what I have. I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Did you look at any kind of robust regressions, like fit a line, if there's something that's an outlier, maybe a low resolution model, you drop the data point or two and refit?
We didn't do any, so the question was, did we look at robust regressions where you have like outlier, throwing out outlier type of things? We didn't do anything like that. For the most part, these are pretty well behaved where you don't have, like it's, you don't really have huge outliers. And so it doesn't seem like something that's super necessary. That, it could be a problem though. Like it could be that there's some type of a implicit outlier throwing out in the model development process, where it's like no one wants to have a model that does something really weird, and so that's kind of being like implicitly thrown out before it comes to us. But yeah, we didn't see anything like that. Yeah.
In fact, on the other side of the scale, I read this book several years ago, you may be familiar with those who don't accept the idea of greenhouses. They believe in more like a 700-year cycle of cooling. I don't know if you're familiar with studies. Is that something this model can be applied to, or is that over that length of time you get to 1,400 years, 20 years? Is that just way too long that this model can be applied, or is that a possibility? Either debunk that or prove that natural cycle is there.
Yeah, so the question is, if there's like a did you say 7,000 years? 700, if there's like a 700-year cycle in global temperature, if there's a hypothesis that that's, that we're just on the upper end of that right now, and that's why the temperatures are warming, if that could be tested with a model like this. And for the most part, we don't run models this sophisticated over like 1,000-year time periods just because of the computational expense. But as computers get faster, that's definitely something that could be done. More fundamentally, the question of like a 700-year cycle is that you need some, since they're physical climate models, you need some physical explanation for why that would be the case, right? And so like we use these systematically to test, not me personally, but many studies use these to systematically test various possible contributors to the climate change that we've seen. So you take a model and you put things in one at a time. You say, okay, we think the sun did this over this time period, put that in the model one at a time, just the sun or just volcanoes or just nitrous oxide or just whatever. And that's where you come up with these estimates that say, no, it's really not those things. It's really CO2 that has caused the warming that we've seen. And so if someone says, oh, it's a 700-year natural cycle, you would need some type of a physical explanation of where that energy is coming from that's actually going to be causing the temperature to change. Yeah.
You mentioned that over time the resolution has improved in the entire model of the Earth. What I'm curious about is, are there specific areas perhaps in the Earth where you want the resolution to be more to get a better result than perhaps having a lower resolution somewhere else on the Earth when you run the model?
Yeah. So some models, so you can see like on this one, that most of the models the resolution is in degrees, so not actually in like kilometers. So it gets higher resolution at the poles. And some models will actually move the pole because they want like higher resolution over the Himalayas or something. And so essentially there'll be a pole there in terms of degrees specifically for that reason, yeah. And the other way is just to use the boundary forcing from a global climate model to then feed that into a higher resolution model at the location that you're specifically interested in. Yeah.
So this is the worst case GHG scenario. So if you take the best case scenario, is there any possibility that we remain below the 2 degrees in your world?
Yeah. So the question is, this was the worst case scenario. If we think about the best case scenario, is there any possibility that we remain below 2 degrees? And we did explicitly calculate that actually, but I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's something like, so this RCP 2.6 is this one, but the uncertainty range does span above and below. So it does span above 2 degrees, above pre-industrial. So RCP, yeah, I didn't mention it. It's representative concentration pathway. And so all that, the representative concentration part just means concentrations of greenhouse gases are prescribed. So that's what's defined. And then the 2.6 or 4.5 or 6.0 or 8.5 means the watts per meter squared forcing that you get by the end of the century. So RCP 8.5 means that by 2100, you've increased greenhouse gases enough to have a 8.5 watts per meter squared forced flux on the climate system. So the best case scenario imagined in these is RCP 2.6, where you only have a 2.6 flux on the climate system, 2.6 watts per meter squared flux on the climate system. And our results do shift this up a little bit, and there's some chance, it's something like 30%, I think, that we would, I forget what the percent is, but it's still below. It's still below 2, so it's like, it's more than a 50% chance that we stay below 2. Yeah. Yeah.
Does your model explicitly deal with fire and drought, or is that something that would then correct for, fires, reducing vegetation, the effect of that?
So the model, so we're using model output that we don't run. So that's just what they just publish it. All these centers publish.
Does that one include fires or that aspect?
The question is, do the models include fires?
And if it doesn't, would yours correct for maybe not for that factor or something?
That's not something, I don't think so. So there's, the models have various sophistication in terms of their land modules and their carbon cycles. And so I think there may be some parameterizations in there that basically say if it's very dry for a long period of time, that would change the carbon cycle this way, and that's effectively like doing a fire type of calculation. But it's not explicitly. There's never a fire just started and then it burned over here. It would be very kind of an unsophisticated type of parameterization in the model. And I can't think of anything with fires that would change, these forcings in a large enough way that it would have a meaningful effect on the amount of global warming that you get over the next 100 years. I mean, it could definitely have an effect locally, but probably not large enough to change our results.
Jets of where there's oil or natural gas, and then they have a fire or flare burn off for a long time period.
Yeah, so aerosols do definitely affect the top of atmosphere energy budget, and part of that is from combustion, both human, coal burning, as well as natural changes in fires. And so, if the changes were large enough, then it could, I guess it could potentially have some influence. And I don't think that that's something that's dynamic in these models, that they're explicitly calculating that. So yeah, it would be, the thing is it's already built into the models that you're assuming some change in forcing over the 21st century. So under RCP 6 or 8.5, you could implicitly say that could come about from a change in greenhouse gases plus this change in fires, or if the change in fires was this, then it would mean the greenhouse gases had to do this or something. But what's pinned is the forcing anyway. So it's kind of a different question, I guess.
Is it like a noise physical, because you have volcano here, you have fires, etc.
Yeah, since what's defined is the trajectory of the forcing, that could come about from kind of infinite ways. Yeah?
Okay, so forcing comes from aerosols, CO2, methane, etc., right? Sulfur dioxide from volcanic eruptions.
Yep.
Perhaps. Now, these models take that forcing, and based on that forcing, is forcing defined continuously in time? Or is it, so what's the discretization there? Or is it defined, by 2030, this is the greenhouse gas emission. By 2040, this is, so how are they pinning the forcing, throughout the next 100 years?
So the question is the time resolution of the forcing. And it's there at every time step. So with things like, like the Mount Pinatubo volcanic eruption in 1991 is a forcing in these models, and so that's why you can see this dip in the black line here, because global temperatures on average in the models go down by a couple tenths of a degree. And so that, is, I believe, at the daily level that, it knows that on that day that volcano went off. And so there wouldn't be a representation of a volcano on the land necessarily, but there would be aerosol in the atmosphere. And so with greenhouse gases, because they don't change, because they do have a large seasonal cycle as well. So I think those are, again, it's almost at the time step of the model. It's not like it's going to be you're going to have a global CO2 change from one 30-minute time step to the next. But on the monthly time scale, the seasonal change is large enough such that I believe that's going to be represented in the models.
Okay, so if you perturb that, right? So let's say I'm assuming a certain billion metric tons of CO2, emission in the United States in 2020 versus 2030 versus 2040. But what if you start to perturb that by small amounts? You can get to a final amount, right, by 2080. But I'm just curious.
Simulate policies finally going into effect and people or countries getting their act together and
Right.
reducing RCP.
How are you kind of baking in the policy changes and other things, coming in earlier or later?
So the question is how I understand your question is right.
Volume of, certain volume of aerosols or whatever by 2070, but it can come in largely from 2020, or it can come in, over time from 2020 to 2040.
Yeah.
And that can affect your final numbers. So you have RCP there, is 2.6 comprehending sort of this pinning, from all of it coming by 2020, or gradually from over 20 years from 2020 to 2040, and then stabilizing.
You should see a dip, right? You showed that corresponding to the volcano, there's a dip. So if everything is concentrated in one place, then you should see something different on the curve.
So it seems fairly linear.
Right. So it seems it's assuming it's a linear dispersion.
But yeah, so the question had to do with the time evolution of these forcings. And so in 2050, this is telling us it's essentially already at its 2.6 in 2050. And the question then becomes okay, there's 30 or 40 models. Did they all get there the same way? Or did they vary in how they got there? And the answer is that they varied in how they got there. So what's pinned is kind of, the ultimate result in every given year, but it could be the case that some models have a forcing in the year 2050 that came about from a different combination, and it could be different in time as well. And so that is just kind of an uncertainty that's underlying our results. It'd be great to there's always a trade-off, right? So what we're holding constant is the forcing over time. You could hold, say, emissions constant, but then you'll get different forcings because some models are going to have CO2 sink faster than other models, and so it's going to go into the ocean. And so they had the same amount of emissions over time, but then they ended up with different concentrations, and so then you're stuck with a different problem. So it's kind of it's something that's hard to get around. Yeah.
Going back to your original equation, you have the forcing and then the feedback factor. And I'm wondering if climate scientists have come to a conclusion if the feedback is helping, in other words, it's negative, or if it's hurting and it's positive.
Yeah, so the question is the feedback factor helping or hurting? So is it positive or negative? So I don't know why that happened again. But so part of the question is definitional. So it's always negative if you include everything. So there's this fundamental negative feedback called the Planck response, and that's just like the Stefan-Boltzmann law, sigma t to the fourth. So if you increase temperature a little bit, you start radiating a lot more energy to space. And so that's the fundamental stabilizing negative feedback in the climate system. So that means that no model and no climate scientist thinks that the feedback is net positive in the sense that you push it and then it just runs away like into infinity, because then we would have already been in a total, Venus state or an ice house state. But relative to that feedback, everything else we think is positive on net, enhancing. So if you start looking at the other major feedbacks, there's the surface albedo feedback, so that's ice melting, there's the cloud feedback, and there's the water vapor feedback. The ice feedback is almost certainly positive just from basic physics. It gets warmer, you melt ice. The water vapor feedback is almost certainly positive just from basic physics. As it gets warmer, the atmosphere tends to have more water vapor. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. The cloud feedback, there's no simple way to calculate it. So that's why there's this uncertainty that I'm talking about. But most models and most other observational studies tend to say that the cloud feedback is either 0 or probably positive, and it's not negative enough to cancel out those other two things. So what ends up being the case is that the feedback ends up enhancing the warming by like 2/3 of the warming comes from the feedbacks, not from the forcing. Yeah.
So are there any types of physical mechanisms other than the main one that you mentioned that are contributing negatively to the feedback?
Are there any other physical mechanisms other than the Planck response contributing negatively to the feedback? So the main one is just in some models there's a negative cloud feedback. There's definitely negative feedbacks like locally, where in some locations you'll get drying because the atmospheric circulation changes, and so then the Earth can emit more radiation to space in those locations. Right, not globally. The main feedbacks are the cloud feedback, water vapor feedback. So the lapse rate feedback is actually a negative feedback. So the lapse rate feedback is, as it gets warmer, so the lapse rate is the change in temperature with altitude. And as it gets warmer, basically because of latent heat release, the lapse rate starts kind of flattening out so that it warms more in the upper atmosphere than it warms at the surface. And if you start putting more energy into the upper atmosphere where it can radiate to space easier, that helps the Earth cool itself down. So that's the other main negative feedback. And on these timescales, those are the main ones. It's the ice albedo feedback, cloud feedback, water vapor feedback, and lapse rate feedback. And then the Planck response, the fundamental one. So 2 of those are negative.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
why do you say the cloud feedback is uncertain? Because if you have more water vapor, then you should have more cloud, right?
Because so clouds depend on temperature and water vapor. So the relative humidity, so if temperature is going up and water vapor is going up, it's not clear if you'll get more clouds or not. Because temperature could be running away faster than water vapor. And then really clouds are not so well behaved that they just kind of follow this simple thermodynamics. It has much more to do with atmospheric circulations and cloud condensation nuclei and just a bunch of processes that make it much more complicated. Yeah.
I was wondering how much photosynthesis contributes to this. I mean, especially in the ocean. Is that?
In terms of the carbon cycle?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, because we're prescribing the amount of forcing going into the future, it's kind of like back calculated that like since we have a given amount of essentially like CO2 going into the future, that could come about from various changes in the carbon cycle. But it does end up, it ends up being non-trivial. I'm not sure the numbers off the top of my head, but like the amount of net primary production from phytoplankton, the models that do kind of dynamically simulate that, it can make a difference in terms of how much carbon ends up staying in the atmosphere going into the future.